My dad cut me off after I got sick because his new wife demanded it. I found out the shocking truth through her son. That was a month ago. Today we exposed her lies and she's begging me to drop the charges. Man, where do I even start with this mess? I guess I'll begin with the basics. I'm 24, been battling chronic illness for the past 2 years, and until recently thought my dad was the biggest disappointment in my life. Turns out I was only half right about that last part. So picture this, I'm living my best life, working at this cool startup in Austin, dating this awesome guy named Marcus who drives a Ford Mustang and makes the best barbecue brisket you've ever tasted. Life was pretty solid, you know. Then boom, out of nowhere I start getting these weird symptoms. Fatigue that felt like I'd been hit by a Mack truck, joint pain that made me feel like I was 80 instead of 22, and this brain fog that made me forget basic stuff like where I put my keys or what I had for breakfast. After months of doctor visits and tests that cost more than my monthly rent, I finally got diagnosed with lupus. For those who don't know, it's this autoimmune thing where your body basically decides to attack itself. Real fun stuff, let me tell you. Now here's where my dad comes into the picture. We'd always been tight, especially after Mom passed when I was 16. He was my rock, you know? The guy who taught me how to change a tire, how to grill the perfect burger, and how to stand up for myself. When he remarried 3 years ago to this woman named Patricia, I was genuinely happy for him. The dude deserved love after grieving Mom for so long. Patricia seemed nice enough at first. She was this put-together real estate agent who drove a white BMW and always smelled like expensive perfume. She had this 17-year-old son, Jake, from her first marriage, and I figured we'd all be one big happy blended family. Boy, was I wrong about that. When I first got sick, Dad was right there. He drove me to appointments in his old Chevy Silverado, helped me research doctors, even offered to help with medical bills when my crappy insurance started giving me the runaround. But then something changed. It was subtle at first. He started canceling our weekly dinner plans, wouldn't return my calls as quickly, and when we did talk, he seemed distracted. The breaking point came about 6 months ago. I was having a particularly rough day, couldn't get out of bed, felt like my joints were on fire, and was stressed about potentially losing my job because of all the sick days. I called Dad, sobbing, asking if he could come over and maybe bring some of that chicken soup he used to make when I was little. His response still makes my stomach turn. He said, and I quote, "I think you need to learn to handle this stuff on your own. Patricia thinks all this attention I'm giving you is preventing you from becoming independent." I was like, "Dad, I have a chronic illness. I'm not asking for attention, I'm asking for support." But he just kept going with this weird script that didn't even sound like him. Patricia has been through a lot with her ex-husband's family drama, and she doesn't want that kind of stress in our home. Maybe it's better if you figure this out without involving us so much. I hung up on him. Didn't talk to him for 3 weeks after that. When I finally did reach out, hoping he'd come to his senses, he told me he thought we should take a break from our relationship until I could get my life together. Update, hey everyone, thanks for all the support so far. This is harder to write than I thought it would be. Some of you are asking about Patricia's son Jake. He becomes really important to this story. Should I continue with how he reached out to me? The next few months were honestly the darkest period of my life. Not only was I dealing with this unpredictable illness that made simple tasks feel impossible some days, but I'd lost my biggest support system. Marcus was amazing, don't get me wrong, but there's something about having your parent abandon you when you're vulnerable that just cuts deep. I threw myself into managing my health, found a great rheumatologist, started on medications that actually helped, and even joined the support group that met at the community center near my apartment. The group was a mix of people with different autoimmune conditions, and hearing their stories made me realize I wasn't alone in feeling abandoned by family members who couldn't handle the inconvenience of chronic illness. One evening in late September, I was at home watching Netflix and eating takeout Chinese food when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and honestly, some days I barely had energy for planned visits, let alone surprise ones. When I looked through the peephole, I saw this tall, lanky teenager with messy brown hair holding a gas station fountain drink. It was Jake, Patricia's son. We'd maybe had 5 real conversations in the 3 years our parents had been married, and most of those were just polite small talk at family gatherings. I opened the door, curious but cautious. "Hey," he said, looking uncomfortable. "Can we talk? It's about your dad and my mom." I invited him in, offered him some leftover lo mein, and we sat on my couch while he fidgeted with his drink cup. What he told me next absolutely blew my mind. Apparently, Patricia had been feeding Dad a completely different story about our relationship. She'd been telling him I was manipulating him, using my illness to get money and attention, and that I'd actually been talking badly about her to other family members. She claimed I'd called her names, said she was a gold digger, and that I was trying to turn Dad against her. "None of that's true though, right?" Jake asked. "Because you've always been cool to me, and this whole thing never made sense?" I assured him that no, I'd never said any of those things. If anything, I'd tried really hard to make Patricia feel welcome in our family, even when she made little comments about how I should try harder to look professional when I was clearly having a flare-up and could barely function. But Jake wasn't done. He pulled out his phone and showed me screenshots of text messages between Patricia and her sister. I'm not going to lie, my hands were shaking as I read them. She was literally bragging about how she'd gotten rid of the daughter problem. and how Dad was so much more focused on their relationship now. The messages were vicious. She called me manipulative, said I was playing the sick card for attention, and even joked about how easy it was to convince Dad that I was just being dramatic about my health issues. One message made me particularly sick. She told her sister that she researched lupus online and decided it wasn't that serious and that I was probably exaggerating for sympathy. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked Jake, because honestly, part of me wondered if this was some kind of setup. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Because it's wrong. My mom has done this before. She broke up my dad's relationship with his brother over some made-up drama. I was younger then and didn't understand what was happening, but now I see the pattern. She can't handle anyone being close to her husband if she's not the center of attention." We talked for 2 more hours. Jake told me about how Patricia had been slowly isolating Dad from his old friends, convincing him that they were negative influences or didn't really care about his happiness. She'd done the same thing with his hobbies, convinced him to sell his motorcycle because it was dangerous, and got him to stop going to his weekly poker games because they were a waste of money. I realized I wasn't just dealing with someone who didn't like me. I was dealing with someone who was systematically controlling and isolating my father. Jake and I came up with a plan. He was going to secretly record Patricia admitting to her lies, and I was going to document everything. The text messages, the timeline of Dad's behavioral changes, everything. It sounds kind of dramatic now, but we both felt like we needed proof that no one could deny. It took about 2 weeks to get what we needed. Jake was smart about it. He didn't push or act suspicious, just listened when Patricia was on the phone with her sister or when she was venting to him about Dad's family. She was so confident in her manipulation that she was surprisingly open about her tactics. The smoking gun came when she was talking to her sister on speakerphone while Jake was supposedly doing homework in the kitchen. Patricia was complaining that Dad had mentioned wanting to call me on my birthday, and she was strategizing about how to prevent it. She literally said, "I've worked too hard getting him away from that attention-seeking brat to let him backslide." Now, Jake recorded the whole conversation on his phone. Update. The evidence Jake and I gathered was pretty damning, but I knew confronting Dad directly might backfire if Patricia got to him first. We needed a different approach. What would you do? Go straight to your parent or involve other family members first? We decided to involve Dad's brother, my Uncle Mike, first. Uncle Mike and Dad had been best friends since childhood, and while Patricia had managed to reduce their contact, she hadn't completely cut them off yet. Uncle Mike lived about an hour away in San Antonio and had always been the type to tell it like it is. I drove down to see Uncle Mike on a Saturday morning, bringing all the evidence Jake and I had collected. Uncle Mike listened to the recordings, read through the screenshots, and his face got redder with each piece of information. "That manipulative witch," he said, and I'd never heard my laid-back uncle sound so angry. "She's been working on isolating your dad for months. I kept wondering why he stopped coming to family barbecues and stopped returning my calls." Uncle Mike had noticed the changes too, but had attributed them to Dad being in a new relationship and wanting to spend time with Patricia. He hadn't realized it was deliberate isolation. We called a family meeting for the next weekend. Uncle Mike reached out to Dad directly, saying he wanted to have a family barbecue at his place, and that it had been too long since everyone got together. He specifically mentioned that I would be there, and that he missed having the whole family together. Dad initially tried to make excuses. Patricia had plans, he wasn't feeling well, work was busy, but Uncle Mike pushed back, saying this was important. Family time, and that one afternoon wouldn't kill anyone. Eventually, Dad agreed to come. The plan was simple. We'd let Dad see me looking healthy and happy, contradict Patricia's narrative that I was this manipulative, attention-seeking person, and then gradually present the evidence of her lies. That Saturday was nerve-wracking. I got to Uncle Mike's place early to help set up, and I was honestly terrified about how Dad would react to seeing me. We hadn't spoken in months, and I didn't know if he'd be cold, angry, or just awkward. When Dad arrived, he came alone. He looked older than I remembered, and there was something different about his whole demeanor, like the confident, funny guy I grew up with had been replaced by someone more cautious and withdrawn. "Hey, kiddo," he said when he saw me, but it was tentative, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to hug me. I kept things light at first. We grilled burgers, I helped Uncle Mike's wife set up the picnic table, and I made sure to be the person Dad remembered, cracking jokes, asking about his work, being genuinely interested in his life. I could see him starting to relax, and for brief moments, it felt like old times. About an hour into the barbecue, Uncle Mike started asking casual questions about Patricia. How was married life treating Dad? Was Patricia settling in well with the family? Did she enjoy the family gatherings? Dad's answers were weird. He kept saying things like, "Patricia thinks," or "Patricia says," instead of expressing his own opinions. When Uncle Mike asked why Patricia didn't come to the barbecue, Dad said she thought family gatherings were too chaotic and preferred smaller, more intimate social situations. That's when I knew Jake was right about the control tactics. Uncle Mike and I exchanged glances, and he gave me a small nod. It was time to start revealing what we'd discovered. "Dad," I said, "can I ask you something? Do you really think I was manipulating you when I was sick?" He looked uncomfortable, glancing around like he was looking for an escape route. "Patricia helped me understand that sometimes when people are struggling, they can make demands on others without realizing it. What demands did I make? I pressed gently. Asking you to drive me to doctor appointments? Wanting you to call me back when I was scared about my diagnosis? Well, no, but... He trailed off, looking confused. Uncle Mike jumped in. Brother, she was sick. She needed her family. That's not manipulation, that's just being human. I could see Dad starting to question the narrative he'd been fed, so I decided to show him the text messages Jake had screenshot. I pulled out my phone and handed it to him. Dad, I need you to read these. They're messages between Patricia and her sister, about me and our relationship. His face went through about 5 different emotions as he read through them. Confusion turned to shock turned to anger, and anger turned to something that looked like horror. She wrote this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There's more, I said, and played him the recording of Patricia talking about keeping him away from his attention-seeking brat. Dad sat down heavily on Uncle Mike's back porch steps, holding his head in his hands. For a few minutes, nobody said anything. I could hear kids playing in the neighbor's yard and someone's music playing softly from a few houses down. Normal? Saturday afternoon sounds that felt surreal given what was happening. I can't believe I fell for this, Dad finally said. I can't believe I abandoned my daughter because someone convinced me she was lying about being sick. The next part of the conversation was hard. Dad started crying, actual tears, talking about how Patricia had gradually convinced him that I was becoming too dependent on him, that I needed tough love to become independent, and that maintaining our close relationship was preventing me from growing up. She made it sound like she was looking out for your best interests, he said. She kept saying that enabling you would make your health problems worse, that you needed to learn to cope on your own. It was manipulation at its finest, taking someone's love for their child and twisting it into something that looked like neglect but felt like protection. Uncle Mike was pacing around his backyard, muttering about how he'd like to give Patricia a piece of his mind. I was mostly just relieved that Dad was finally seeing the truth, but I was also angry about the months of pain and isolation I'd endured because of her lies. What do we do now? Dad asked. Update. My dad finally saw through Patricia's manipulation, but confronting her was going to be tricky. She'd already proven how skilled she was at controlling situations. We needed a plan that wouldn't give her a chance to spin new lies or turn Dad against us again. Any guesses on how this played out? Jake had been texting me updates throughout the weekend. Patricia was already suspicious about Dad going to a family barbecue without her, and she'd been asking lots of questions about who was there and what they talked about. Jake said she seemed agitated and had been making comments about how Dad's family was probably filling his head with nonsense. We decided that Dad needed to confront Patricia directly, but with backup. Uncle Mike offered to be there, and Jake agreed to record the conversation from his room upstairs. We planned it for the following Tuesday evening when Patricia would be home from work, but before she had time to prepare any new manipulative strategies. Dad was nervous about the confrontation. He'd spent months being controlled and gaslighted, and even though he could see the truth now, he was worried about falling back under her influence. We rehearsed what he would say and agreed that if Patricia tried to twist things around or make him doubt himself, he would look at the evidence again. Tuesday evening came, and I was sitting in my apartment basically chain-eating microwave popcorn and waiting for updates. Jake had texted me that Dad had arrived and they were all in the living room. Then radio silence for about an hour. When my phone finally buzzed, it was a text from Dad. Can you come over? Bring Uncle Mike. This is bigger than we thought. I called Uncle Mike and we drove over to Dad and Patricia's house together. My stomach was in knots the entire 20-minute drive. When we got there, Jake met us at the door looking shaken. My mom completely lost it, he whispered. Like, completely. She's upstairs now, but she was screaming and throwing things. She admitted to everything and then some. We walked into the living room where Dad was sitting on the couch looking like he'd been hit by a truck. There were pieces of a broken picture frame on the floor and a lamp that had been knocked over. She confessed to everything, Dad said without looking up. The lies about you, manipulating me into cutting you off, isolating me from my friends and family. But it gets worse. Apparently, when Dad confronted Patricia with the evidence, she initially tried to deny it. But when he played the recording of her calling me an attention-seeking brat, she realized there was no way to spin it. That's when she completely snapped. She started screaming about how she'd worked too hard to fix Dad's life to let his pathetic daughter ruin it. She said I was weak and needy and that Dad was better off without dead weight dragging him down. She called me names I won't repeat and said she'd been doing Dad a favor by helping him see what a burden I was. But then she said something that made everything click into place for Dad. She told him that she'd convinced her first husband to cut ties with his family too, and it had worked perfectly until he got weak and started missing them. She said she wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Jake had been right. This was a pattern for her. She systematically isolated the men she married from their support systems to maintain complete control over them. She also admitted to lying about your health, Dad continued. She said she researched lupus and decided it wasn't serious enough to warrant the attention you were getting. She actually said she thought you were faking some of your symptoms. That hit me like a punch to the gut. This woman had convinced my father to abandon me while I was dealing with a serious chronic illness because she decided my medically diagnosed condition wasn't real enough for her liking. But Dad wasn't finished. There's more. She's been stealing money from me. It turned out that Patricia had been taking money from Dad's savings account to pay for things for herself and Jake, things she'd told Dad she was paying for with her own money. She'd bought Jake a new laptop, paid for expensive clothes for herself, and had even used Dad's money to pay down debt from her previous marriage. We're talking about thousands of dollars over the past year. When I confronted her about the money, she said I owed it to her for putting up with my family drama. Dad said. She meant you. She said dealing with your health problems and my relationship with you was emotional labor that deserved compensation. At this point, I was beyond angry. This woman had not only manipulated my father into abandoning me during one of the most difficult periods of my life, but she'd also been stealing from him and considered my illness to be a burden worthy of financial compensation. Uncle Mike was pacing again, and I could tell he was struggling not to march upstairs and give Patricia a piece of his mind. Jake was sitting quietly in the corner, looking embarrassed and upset about his mother's behavior. "Where is she now?" I asked. "Upstairs packing," Dad said. "I told her she needed to leave tonight." "What about the money she stole?" Dad looked tired. "I told her she needs to pay it back, but honestly, I just want her gone. The money isn't worth continuing to deal with her." But I wasn't ready to let it go that easily. This woman had caused months of pain and suffering for both Dad and me, had stolen thousands of dollars and was probably going to do the same thing to her next victim. Someone needed to hold her accountable. "Dad," I said, "I think we need to call the police." He looked shocked. "For what?" "Theft, for starters. Fraud. And I want to talk to a lawyer about whether what she did counts as elder abuse or financial exploitation." Uncle Mike nodded approvingly. "She's right, brother. This woman systematically isolated you, manipulated you, and stole from you. That's not just relationship drama, that's criminal behavior." Jake spoke up for the first time. "I can testify about the theft. I knew she was using money that wasn't hers, but I thought it was like a joint account thing. I didn't realize she was stealing." We called the police that evening. 2 officers came to the house and took statements from all of us. They were particularly interested in the recorded conversations and the evidence Jake had gathered about the theft. When they went upstairs to talk to Patricia, we could hear her yelling and claiming she was the victim of a vindictive family that had never accepted her. The officers came back downstairs and told us that Patricia had admitted to taking the money but claimed it was payment for household expenses and emotional labor. She'd also made some threats about making Dad's life difficult if he pursued legal action against her. "Those threats alone are enough for us to arrest her tonight," one of the officers said. "Combined with the evidence of theft, we have enough to charge her with several crimes." They arrested Patricia that evening. Jake stayed with us, Dad insisted, and we spent the next few hours talking through everything that had happened. Jake was upset about his mom being arrested, which I understood, but he also said he was relieved that the truth was finally out. Over the next few weeks, more details came to light. Patricia had been running a similar scam with her previous husband, and there were other instances of her manipulating family relationships for financial gain. Her ex-husband's family had tried to warn Dad when they first got married, but Patricia had convinced Dad they were just bitter about the divorce. The legal process moved quickly. Patricia was charged with theft, fraud, and making criminal threats. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor felt the pattern of behavior and the amount of money involved warranted serious consequences. Last week, Patricia was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by probation. She also has to pay restitution to Dad for the money she stole, plus additional fines. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was just a confused woman who made mistakes in a difficult relationship, but the judge wasn't buying it. Ms. Patricia showed a deliberate pattern of manipulation and exploitation, the judge said during sentencing. She systematically isolated her husband from his support system, convinced him to abandon his sick daughter, and stole significant amounts of money while doing so. This wasn't confusion, this was calculated abuse. The day of her sentencing, Patricia tried to approach me outside the courthouse. She was crying and begging me to ask the judge for leniency, saying she was sorry and that she'd learned her lesson. She kept saying it was all a misunderstanding and that she never meant to hurt anyone. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "You convinced my father to abandon me while I was battling a chronic illness because you decided my medically diagnosed condition wasn't serious enough to deserve support. You stole thousands of dollars from him while claiming to love him. The only thing you're sorry about is getting caught." She tried to grab my arm, still begging, but Dad stepped between us. "You've done enough damage," he told her. "Stay away from my family." That was the last time I saw Patricia, and hopefully, it will stay that way. Dad and I have been rebuilding our relationship slowly. He's been going to therapy to understand how he got manipulated so thoroughly, and he's working on rebuilding the friendships and family connections that Patricia destroyed. It's not easy. Trust takes time to rebuild, and I'm still processing the pain of being abandoned when I needed him most, but we're getting there. Last weekend, he came over and made that chicken soup I'd asked for months ago. We sat on my couch, watched old movies, and talked about everything that had happened. He apologized probably a dozen times, and while I'm not ready to forget what happened, I'm ready to forgive and move forward. Jake has been staying with Dad while his mom is in prison. He's a good kid who got caught in his mother's toxic patterns, and I'm glad he had the courage to expose the truth. He's been seeing a counselor too, working through his own feelings about his mother's behavior and the family dynamics he grew up with. Uncle Mike jokes that he's never been so happy to be right about someone being trouble, but he's also been a huge support system for Dad as he works through everything. The whole experience has actually brought our family closer together, which is probably the opposite of what Patricia intended. My health is doing better too. Having my support system back has made a huge difference in managing my lupus, and the stress of dealing with family drama isn't weighing on me anymore. I've learned a lot about setting boundaries and recognizing manipulative behavior, which are skills I hope I'll never need again, but I'm glad to have. Looking back, I think the scariest part of this whole situation was how gradually it happened. Patricia didn't just show up and immediately convince Dad to cut me off. She slowly planted seeds of doubt, gradually isolated him from his support system, and carefully constructed a narrative that made her manipulation seem like love and concern. If Jake hadn't spoken up, Dad might still be under her control, and I might have lost my father forever. I'm sharing this story because I want people to understand how sophisticated emotional manipulation can be, especially when it targets someone's relationships with their family. If you have a family member who suddenly starts pulling away from you, especially after getting into a new relationship, it might be worth looking deeper into what's really going on. Sometimes the people we love aren't choosing to hurt us. They're being convinced that hurting us is the right thing to do. And if you're dealing with a chronic illness, please know that needing support from your family isn't manipulation. It's human. Don't let anyone convince you that asking for help when you're struggling makes you a burden. You deserve love and support, especially when you're facing health challenges. Dad and I still have work to do to fully repair our relationship, but we're committed to getting there. Patricia is paying the consequences for her actions, and Jake is building a healthier life away from his mother's toxic influence. It's not the ending I would have chosen, but it's the ending where the good people end up okay, and the person who caused all the damage faces real consequences for her actions. Sometimes justice actually works out, even when it takes longer than you'd like.